It says that we are live now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from whichever part of the world that you're joining us. Welcome to another special Karma Heritage lecture here on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us. And it gives me, on behalf of Team Karma, immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Murad Khan Mumtaz, who is an associate professor of art at Williams College in Massachusetts. Additionally, Sir is also an artist who's trained in the North Indian styles of painting and has written a book called Faces of God, which is available in open access last year, which talks about the Jahan Ara Begum and, of course, the arts in question today, that is the Dara Shikoh album. Sir, thank you very much for accepting our invitation today, and I hand it over to you. A few housekeeping rules, dear audience. We would have the lecture for about 40 to 45 minutes, sir. Yes, sir. And which would leave us with about 15 minutes for Q&A from both myself. And if you have questions, please type those out in the chat box and our team would read these out to sir eventually. Thank you very much, sir. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chandni and Ishan for the invitation. Really happy to be participating. It seems like a wonderful initiative that you have, Karvan Heritage. So I'm really happy to be part of it today. And yes, what I'll be discussing briefly is elements from the book, particularly focusing on Dara Shikoh's early patronage and images, paintings that were made for particularly the Muraqqa. So I'll share the screen now. And can you see that? Is it shared?
Yes, sir, we can.
Excellent. Theek. So just a little bit of a quick background. Dara Shikoh, of course, was the son of Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and he was the heir in line to be the successor of Shah Jahan. And what's important to note, of course, is in the mid 1630s, around 1634, 35, he also got involved into the Qadri order of Sufism. So we have to look at his painting patronage through the light and through the lens of devotion necessarily, because he and his sister were both very much involved within Islamic spirituality in Hindustan. So that's the lens that I'll be using today to look at the Dara Shikoh's Muraqqa. Muraqqa means album, and it's a Persianate art form. You can think about it as a mobile museum of sorts in which you have disparate folios of paintings and beautiful calligraphies being brought together in conversation with each other from different times, or sometimes made for the patrons themselves to create new meanings. And this is exactly what happens in Dara Shikoh's Muraqqa. Muraqqa literally means patched, like the patched robe of a Sufi. And it also means pages, ruqqa. So we're bringing in together, patching together different folios, pages together to create new meaning. And the reason why this is such a special and important album or Muraqqa is because it is primarily intact, not 100% intact. It's gone through changes and it's gone through some dispersal, but more or less we can see it in its original format, and that is very, very unusual for Hindustani Muraqqa, especially for Mughal Muraqqas or other Muraqqas from South Asia. Usually the history of collecting has meant that over the decades and centuries, these albums are then torn away and either repurposed to create new albums or are taken apart for collections and museums and auction houses. So it's very, very, very rare to have near complete albums from this period. The period we're focusing on is the 1630s. The album itself, there's been a lot of debate about its exact dating because, as you can see, let's see if I have a detail of this. As you can see here on the opening folios, there are a lot of collectors and librarian marks and inscriptions. And when we move to the actual inscription that that got covered by Dara Shikoh's brother Aurangzeb Alamgir when he came into power. It's likely that it got covered during that time, but over time that gold has faded away and revealed the original inscription, which basically dates the Muraqqa at the time when it was presented by Dara Shikoh to his fiancée Nadira Banu Begum. And so the date we have here is 1641-42. However, the Muraqqa was actually made a few years earlier. And that's why the date that we usually think of is around 1630 to 34. And the reason for that is that we have one painting in this album, which is actually dated with the name of the Ustad. And it says here, the work of Muhammad Khan Musawwir, Amale Muhammad Khan Musawwir. And then you have the date, Sun 1043, which corresponds to around 1633-34. So one could think about this as an anchor date. And then particularly Jeremiah Losty has argued that when we look at some of these paintings themselves from the album, and we'll talk about them at greater length as we proceed with the discussion, especially when we think about a young Dara Shikoh. He suggested that most of the portraits of young princes are more or less representations of Dara Shikoh, and they are all showing him as a teenager. So definitely not 1641-42, because by then he had actually grown a beard. So we know from the date of the artist's signature, as well as from the way Dara Shikoh looks, that he was most likely a teenager. And the date can be around 1630 to 34 is the more or less agreed upon date for this album itself. And the region, of course, that we're focusing on for this album, it was made, this is a map showing the extent of the Mughal Empire and other regions within South Asia. The region that we are primarily focusing is the Delhi, Agra, Lahore region. And of course, Kashmir also becomes the summer capital for the Mughals. So this is the northern Hindustan would be the place that we are focusing on, because these were itinerant rulers. They would travel from one capital to the other, and their artists would also travel with them. And the dates that we generally have for Dara Shikoh, 1615 to 1659. Of course, he was killed by his brother during the War of Succession. But the time that we're focusing on is when he was maybe between ages 15 to around 18, just before he enters proper maturity and adulthood, prior to him keeping a beard, in which he is shown clean shaven. So we know the theme of the album because we have this little inscription that clearly says that this precious Muraqqa was given to his dearest and intimate friend, who was his fiancée, who he married, Nadira Banu Begum, by Muhammad Dara Shikoh. And this was done at the time of their wedding. So the whole theme within the album is actually celebrating this union, this coming together of two individuals. And as we look at a lot of these folios, that is exactly what we see unfolding. There's a lot of pairs coming together, and that happens in two different ways. The most common way that happens is of two types. For example, in this case, you have an aged scholar / saintly type, and on the right, you have a Dara Shikoh type young prince viewing each other. And that happens across two folios. So you have on one side one folio, and then on the other side the other, and they're facing each other. So this interaction, this coming together of a pair is happening across folios. In some other folios, that even happens in the same painting as well. And here's another example of two birds looking at each other, this sort of darshan happening across folios, and this beautiful pink flowers, the color pink, and the flowing stream really connects the two folios together. So we have to think of this open bifolio as one big composition that enhances this theme of union, of coming together, of love. And that basic theme is explored throughout the album in various ways. You have birds coming together, you have flowers being paired together, you have the young boy, the youth, and the old man facing each other. You have the prince and the princess facing each other. In this case, you have two earlier paintings, most likely made during the Salim or Jahangir period, being repurposed for this album. And you can see how they've been added upon because you can see the cutout here. And then the artists who were working on this album extended the background further so that it could fit into this given scale of the album itself. And here you have two yogis facing each other and coming into communication with each other. So there's a lot of this pairing happening throughout. And in this case, it's a very fascinating double folio because you have two Europeans coming together, and this is something which Professor Yael Rice, I think, has also talked about, or some other professor, I'm forgetting, talking about how, in a way, you can see the aspirations of Dara Shikoh here seen standing alone, viewing the Europeans, because within the European culture, it's more natural or more acceptable to show your feelings and emotions by actually touching each other in public. So that is allowed in a way, in a way through the painting. This prince's aspirations and desires are being expressed by the two couples who are holding hands, something which you wouldn't really see a Mughal prince doing in a garden setting or in public. So it's a fascinating double folio that also shows the pair coming together in one painting itself. So these are some of the major types of artworks that are depicted. But what really got me thinking about this album, its inner meaning, was the continuous repetition of one specific theme in the album, which has to do with these youths, mostly younger boys, but also in some cases Jahanara-like princessly types, who are either communicating with or are being viewed by these older Sufi-looking men. And that got me thinking about this theme that, yes, the main overarching theme of this album is love and the coming together of two entities and this aspiration towards union. But then within that, you have different types of union being depicted. And the most common type is the one that I'm showing you right now on this shared screen. So what does that mean? Why do we keep seeing Dara Shikoh as this ideal clean-shaven youth, this prince, constantly again and again being viewed by these Sufi types? And that I realized that we have to start from really the beginning of Dara Shikoh's story, but also of the Muraqqa itself. And it is very clear, and although this happens a little later, it's clear that Dara Shikoh, even as a teenager, was already in the company of Sufis, mystics, mendicants, whatever you call them. And we see that in paintings also regularly, in which he is in the company of this majlis type settings. And that eventually, once he achieved maturity, he ended up being attached to the Qadri order of Mia Mir, who we see here depicted in old age on the right, which is a beautiful, stunning Shah Jahan period painting in the British Library. And Mia Mir was an avowed and acknowledged saint from Lahore, and both Emperors Jahangir and Shah Jahan would visit him whenever they were stationed or going through Lahore. And in one of those visits, Dara Shikoh also visited him. And that started off a lifelong relationship of Dara Shikoh with the Qadri order. Mia Mir passed away in 1635, but a little bit after that, 3-4 years later, Dara Shikoh got initiated into the Mia Mir's order by Mia Mir's successor, Mullah Shah. And that is the sort of backdrop or backstory that Dara Shikoh, unlike other princes of the court, of the Persianate courts even, was much more in tune with Sufi and mystical aspirations from a very early age. And those elements you start seeing right from the beginning in the Dara Shikoh album. And of course, Sufi, just to clarify for those who might, is a practitioner of Islamic mysticism, and Sufism, tasawwuf, is the path for attaining of knowledge or union with God, which is, of course, a reality of Islam across the globe. So, oops, jumping ahead. I'll skip this part and not go too much into detail with this element and come right directly into the album itself. So there's an album, usually, typically, when we think about the Persianate album, they open with an album preface called a Dibache. And it is suggested by scholars, which includes Chughtai, who wrote about the album preface of the Dara Shikoh Muraqqa and also has been corroborated by Supriya Gandhi, that the album preface, that this album actually did have a preface, a Dibache, which has been saved in a manuscript in the British Library and in other libraries. And Abdurrahman Chughtai gives us the edited version of that, which he managed to print and circulate. And other scholars have used that as well. So for me, that was the place to start to understand the underlying meaning of the album and why do we see Dara Shikoh in this particular, almost iconic way again and again in this album. So the album preface starts with praise, which the pen is incapable of writing and the imagination unable to visualize, to the calligrapher who brings forth the down of the adolescent beards, Naukhatan, and the painter of the portraits of idols, beloveds or beauties. For the master artist of his God's power decorated the page of the sun with golden lines, and the designer of his handicraft fashioned the side-faced or half-faced moon into a portrait. Creatures of the earth in every corner of the land sing his praises, and heavenly beings of every form chant his name with their tongues. So writes Dara Shikoh in this preface. The original preface in the album is no longer extant. It only survives in the form of later copies preserved in collections of prose. Then I believe that some answers can be found in the opening of the album preface. Dara Shikoh follows the typical Farsi, Persianate preface writing convention, which is always acknowledging and praising God. God is the first artist. In most Dibache album prefaces, God is shown as the first artist, the creator. But then we also have this other layer which connects directly to the images in the album, which is the mention of this youth, this ideal, iconic depiction of the youth in Persian literature, particularly romantic and devotional poetry. The beloved is usually represented as a youthful boy, too young to don a beard, with only the down emerging on his face. Poets always use this word khat, which has two meanings. One means that fuzzy down on the face of a handsome youth, which you can actually see on Dara Shikoh's face. And the other is the meaning calligraphy, khattati. So by opening his album preface, which Dara Shikoh wrote himself, with this theme in which God, the master artist, creates the adolescent's down as the icon of beauty, Prince Dara Shikoh appears to align his own image, his own persona, with this particular ideal of beauty, with this ideal of divine manifestation, which is an acknowledged ideal across the Islamicate and Persianate world. So he's very much following those ideas that are already circulating through literature, poetry, and courtly habits in the Persian-speaking Islamicate world. So these ideal depictions of young princes in the album folios are all beardless. And this points to this interpretation. Here's a detail which you can see. It's a beautifully painted image. And you can really see exactly that happening. You just have a little bit of that facial hair. Otherwise, there's no beard. Everything is very iconic or idealized. That straight nose, that fair complexion. It's all very an ideal depiction of Dara Shikoh. So then the question is, how do we situate this idea of Dara Shikoh being represented by his court artists as this ideal? What is the precedent? What is the earlier history in Mughal period painting? So that's something which we can briefly discuss today. So what we see in the Dara Shikoh album are mostly a particular type of Sufi, which is usually, you can think of that type as the wandering dervish. Sometimes they're called kalandars. Essentially, they are an unruly branch of Sufism, and they feature prominently in this album. And their presence is intrinsically linked to the devotional motif with which Dara Shikoh's preface began. The young prince cast as the focus of God's manifestation in the album. And here in folios such as this, they are shown viewing this Dara Shikoh-like prince. And these compositions themselves illustrate a classic Sufi theme that is found across the Persianate world, both historically as well as in poetry. It is usually this sort of antinomian, rakish, subversive Sufi, mostly identified as the Qalandar, who becomes infatuated by a younger male beloved. In 17th century Hindustan, we have several historical examples of that as well, in which you see on the left the Qalandar Shah Hussain, who fell in love with a Brahmin Hindu boy, again shown beardless, mustacheless, Madhulal. And then the other famous example is the originally Armenian Jewish-born mystic who became Muslim and then became a wandering Kalandari Darvesh, who also fell in love with a Hindu boy called Abhay Chand. And so you have even depictions of them. They were incredibly popular. Both these saints were also poets and had a huge popular appeal as well. And in this case, both are shown viewing those beloveds, those clean-shaven younger beloveds. So that was very much already a historically enacted reality, but also at the same time a literary trope that was used for various symbols and for various reasons. Both are adored to this day for their poetry. So across the Persianate world, by the early modern period, in addition to denoting a Sufi lineage, the term Qalandar had become synonymous with a particular hal, like a state of being, a way of life. And they regarded themselves as those that are not bound to the Islamic Sharia. They're antinomians. They are known as Bishar within the culture itself. And here's a detail from the Dara Shikoh album. And they often ostentatiously appropriated socially transgressive acts such as smoking hemp, drinking wine, and then keeping the company of young adolescent youths. The Indic and Persian cultures acknowledge them as sanctified beings, as guides who had already united with God and therefore were no longer fettered by conventional acts of piety or religiosity. So they're very much part of this cultural imagination within the Islamicate and the Persianate world. And it became very much an ignoble Qalandari way of life. and it was permanently etched into the Muslim cultural imagination. And you hear about that constantly in all the famous poets, Rumi, Hafiz, uh, in particularly ghazal poetry. It's such a theme, and and it's really important that we focus on the poetry itself, because most of the paintings that we are looking today all have couplets or quatrains or poetry of specifically the arguably the most famous poet of the entire Islamicate and Persianate world, Hafiz Shirazi. And he mentions the Qalandars as an ideal several times in his poetry as well. For example, in one poem, he says how the Qalandars of truth reality don't buy even half a penny's worth of a silken robe from the one who doesn't have any skills. So he's ridiculing mainstream Sufis through this, who by this time were gaining in cultural and political currency. And he's sort of celebrating the Qalandari culture overall. And with Hafiz, the figure of the rakish antinomian who consciously deviated from social norms in order to negate or overcome his lower ego, while also presenting a moral mirror to other Sufis, became widespread. And this is the precise wisdom of poets such as Hafiz that was then imparted to nobility and royalty and the children of those royalty and nobility across the Persian-speaking Muslim world. And Dara Shikoh, of course, was no exception. And in his biography of Muslim saints, the Safinatul Awliya, he has an entire section on the Qalandar group. So clearly it was an important sect within Sufism. And in two paintings from the Dara Shikoh album, the prince as an adolescent faces a Sufi who is reciting the poetry of Hafiz. In this case, you see it within the same folio, that you have this interaction and gazing happening. And he seems to be here busy with a lesson. You have the ink pot, you have books, clearly some sort of lesson, but what lesson is there is taking shape. So you have the scholar, saint, whoever, most likely his teacher, with an open book with couplets written in the open book. So it's clearly telling us of its own story. And the couplets in this story, in this open book, are from Hafiz, from his divan. And it says, when God bound the form, Surat, of your heartwarming eyebrows, he enclosed the solutions to my problems in their playful movement. So in order to understand its multi-layered meaning, this painting must be read in tandem with this particular text. In the most literal sense, the painting depicts a royal poetry or calligraphy lesson. But knowing what we know about this poet being recited, Hafiz, as well as that preface written by Dara Shikoh himself about the young male, the youths being this ideal of beauty, the subtext of witnessing the divine in human form, in particular as a beardless youth, becomes evident. So there's a sort of reciprocity that's happening between this viewing. And this brings us to the controversial subject of witnessing the divine in the form of a beardless youth, which was very much part of a particular segment of Sufism as well. And it is known as this particular word. It has both negative and neutral connotations. It's known as Shahid Bazi. And to quote another scholar, Cyrus Ali Zargar, this is a very important movement within Sufism, which began to increasingly associate the Shahid with the human form, literally the locus of witnessing, especially that of a beardless young man. And this resulted not only in one of the most important poetic images in Sufi literature, but also one of the most controversial practices of certain Sufis, namely gazing at beautiful faces. And I, in my scholarship and research, have taken that one step ahead by saying that this act was also part of devotional painting. So it wasn't just a literary trope, it wasn't just a historical phenomena, but it was also very much part of Hindustani devotional painting. Culturally, the term Shahidbazi has always walked the line between socially censured practices and the devotionally acceptable act of viewing outer beauty. But Persian poets themselves really popularized this Shahidbazi in the medieval period, such as Ahmad Ghazali and Hafiz, Hadduddin al-Kirmani, lots of poets, linked it to several apocryphal prophetic sayings. And one such saying of which is not a solid hadith, but it is quoted a lot by Sufis, says that I saw my Lord in the form of a beardless youth, wearing a cloak of gold, upon his head a crown of gold, and upon his feet sandals of gold. And therefore, famous Sufi poets such as Attar, Iraqi, Khusro, Ruzbehan Bakli regularly cite such contested prophetic sayings, thus contributing to the act of Shahidbazi becoming a popular convention, literature, and then later on we see that being represented in painting as well. What's important to note is that according to scholars such as Cyrus Zargar, although Shahidbazi was culturally transgressive in a Persianate context, in Sufi circles it was for the most part a Platonic appreciation of divine beauty in human form, one affected by a pre-existing cultural appreciation for the beauty of a beardless young man, and thus a practice devoid of licentiousness. The practice itself is intrinsically linked to the superiority given by major Sufi orders to ishq, God's love. That's the core around which this practice involved. Love which is reciprocated by the lover with passionate ardor, of course known as ishq. And in this practice, the act of viewing a beautiful face becomes the spark that lights the heart with the fire of longing for God, an outlook in which love is the axis of all creation. And witnessing or gazing at beauty allows one entry into the presence of love, thereby gaining union with God. So that's the highest ideal for this practice. And Hafiz, of course, plays with this theme a lot and brings out a lot of double entendres and meanings out of this as well. For example, in one poem, he says, "Behold the insistent breeze like the rakish Shahidbaz, sometimes grabbing the rose's lips and sometimes the grass's hair." In such poems, the proverbial garden, such an intrinsic space within the Islamic cultural imagination, with its flowers, trees, and grass, becomes a mirror of the beautiful human figure. So then we can come back to that Dara Shikoh album folio. And when we look at it through this lens of Shahidbazi, this folio becomes far more nuanced than a mere school lesson. Because then we see how this sage-like tutor is actually has his vision locked and viewing the young Dara Shikoh. He sits in a meditative posture with a scarf wrapped around his knees. It's very staged, with the two figures shares further demarcated by the scholar seated on this chandni, this white carpet. And which is embroidered. And I discussed this at greater length in the book as well. And then in the back, you have this slender tree that is sort of providing him shade as well. I won't go into too many details about its sort of hierarchical depiction of space, but more importantly, what we're trying to notice how is that it's not just the lesson happening, it's actually the tutor also engaged in witnessing God's beauty in the form of a youth. And then we can think about the poem itself again, because that's what the tutor is holding. The black rosary that he's counting hints at the devotional undercurrent of the painting. But the clearest signifier is the already quoted couplet, when God bound the form of your heartwarming eyebrows. The beardless princely youth, through the beauty of his form, thus becomes the old ascetic's locus for the manifestation of God. The mutual gaze, which is precisely the act of nazar, is a parallel to the Indic darshan, allows the Sufi to drink in this revelation of God's beauty. And then the second hemistich proclaims that God has enclosed all the solutions to his worries in the twitching, arching, playful eyebrows of the beloved. So, in addition to being a portrait of the young heir apparent engaged in a lesson, the painting is an illustration of the Hafiz couplet and recapitulates a favorite devotional motif regularly found in both literary and visual examples. So that sort of sets the tone for us to understand the theme of this of these paintings. And then in other albums, you start seeing this theme actually very common and very well uh, depicted. Here's another album which is at Oxford in the Bodleian Library. It's contested as to who for whom it was made. But in any case, you have this prince again, very Dara Shikoh-esque prince. Maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's some other prince, but clearly a Mughal prince in the company of these dervishes. And there are certain scenes which show that mutual viewing as well as mutual education happening. But clearly there's a theme, there's a running theme that you can see. And in the folio on the right, you actually see a Qalandar dervish who is immediately recognized by his patched cloak as well as his dots on his arm, which are typical signs of Qalandars for a part of some of their initiatic practices. They would burn marks on their arms and body. And most likely he's also smoking hemp, and you can see this smoke rising. So clearly a Qalandar who is part of this gathering of Sufis in which this Dara Shikoh-like prince is clearly being viewed as the locus of God's beauty as well. So that theme suddenly you start seeing everywhere. And then there are earlier precedents for that theme, even in Jahangir period and Salim period paintings that you can see here. For example, this is from an album in the Chester Beatty Library from the Minto album, in which you have that Darwesh and his followers in the company of youthful princely types. In this case, it's this particular prince who is the locus or center around which the composition is staged. And again, you have another beardless youth, clearly an embodiment of God's beauty. Also, a companion of an older Sufi. So this theme you actually start seeing everywhere in Mughal painting during this time. And in this case, it becomes even more literal and proof beyond doubt that this is exactly what's happening, because this is, in fact, an illustrated divan of Hafiz made in the Mughal atelier for Emperor Jahangir, in which, in one of the later illustrations, is illustrating a poem of Hafiz, in which you literally see the poet, the Sufi poet Hafiz, viewing the youth, who is shown here in this idealized, iconic way, almost like a flower. He's holding a narcissus flower, but he himself is petal-like. That's what the poem describes him as. And this is the proverbial garden, the paradisal garden, in which the Quran says that people who enter the gardens of paradise will have these young male beautiful youths as well as the female houris. So this idea is being captured in this painting, illustrating the very poetry of Hafiz, which is used for, of course, later on by Dara Shikoh as well. So there's clear precedent here for such depictions. And that's the poem that's being illustrated of Hafiz. I can't bear that you strut gracefully viewing the garden, for you are more pleasant than the rose and fresher than the wild rose. So he becomes almost this archetype of paradisal beauty that is being gazed upon by this longing Sufi figure, who in this case is also Hafiz. And so that theme I am claiming in my scholarship, that you see that in this case, there is a division between the two realities, the ontological or mystical realities. In this case, the boy inhabits a higher reality. He's actually standing further up. He's on the right side. And the desiring, aspiring Sufi is on the other side of the fountain. So there are clearly two spiritually distinct spaces. And I'm trying to show how that division of space in the Dara Shikoh album happens across the two folios. They each inhabit different spaces, each embody different hierarchical zones. So I think I shouldn't say more. I can go on, but I'll stop here. This was just basically just a quick introduction to the Dara Shikoh album, and also to show what is the underlying motivation behind creating this album, that on the surface is very much about love and pairs coming together. It was made as a gift by Dara Shikoh to gift to his fiance and his wife Nadira Banu Begum, but yet underlying meanings suggest that this was also some sort of act by the parts of the artists of the atelier to depict and represent Dara Shikoh himself in this fleeting moment of his youth as a teenager as the locus of God. So I will end my talk here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very visually stunning lecture and your groundbreaking work on how we actually view these Mughal paintings. So, if it could be possible, if you could please take the camera down, the slideshow down, so that people can
All
see
right.
you.
Stop share. All right.
Thank you, sir. So I have a lot of questions, but we also have questions in the chat box. So I'll begin with Professor Harbans Mukhia's question. And he asks that shouldn't it be Shikoh, as in Shukoh, Shukoh, which means glory in Persian, rather than Shikoh, which means terror in Persian? As
That's yeah, Dara Shikoh. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it's debated. Some scholars write Shuk, because when you're writing it in the Persian, you don't really see the accent. But yes, you can really definitely Shuko is another like a yeah. I would agree.
And so we have a question from Shakir ul Hassan, who asks that did Dara also commission paintings of Kashmiri rishis, and what was the Mughal attitude in general about them now that he's commissioning paintings of Mullah Shah?
There is one fascinating painting which I talk about in my book that seems to be maybe a Trikka Shaivite Kashmiri rishi, in which he is shown in conversation with Dara Shikoh's own guide, Mullah Shah. And that painting is at the Bharat Kala Bhavan in Banaras. And not work has been done on it. I haven't seen it in person, of course, because I can't get a visa to come to India in the current climate. Hopefully that'll change. But I have a high-res image of it, and I didn't really go and make any claims about what it is, but my hunch is that it is a depiction of a Shaivite Kashmiri in conversation with, because Dara Shikoh is equally interested in yogic traditions as well. So that's a very good question. And I feel that there are paintings. We just need to focus on them and we will find them. That's my hunch.
Thank you, sir. Meanwhile, please feel free to put your questions. I'm going to ask mine because I'm going to use this opportunity. So, when we say that young love is being depicted in these paintings, is it because young love is associated with innocence, or is it that, let's say, in today's world, a person in their 20s or their 30s would be considered young, which probably was not the case for the Mughals, was it?
I think in this case, it's to do with this sort of purity, virginal beauty, untainted. You haven't entered adulthood, so you are innocent and pure. And it has to also do with the visual, because it's a visual marker that when a boy, when someone enters manhood, the beard comes across, and then suddenly you have entered a new phase of life. You have a wife, you have children, and that's the typical understanding of the culture, the Persianate culture. And so there's this 5-6 year period. It's almost, and that's why these youths are constantly being compared with flowers, because flowers also have this fleeting beauty that is unique to this particular given time period, just like Dara Shikoh is represented in that age, circa 15 to 18, after which you then enter maturity. So I think it's visual, and it's also to do with purity. And so there's this idea that for a fleeting instance, these become locuses and focus for God's beauty, and then it's gone.
So, could it have a more sinister underlying tone, as in maybe he's Nadir Banu is just an excuse. He's trying to cater to the Shahidbazi of the Sufi saints. Could that be a reason why young love is being talked about so much in this album, seemingly shared between a couple?
I think it's like his artists and perhaps his people around him and himself. There's clearly a reason for that, like that he's being shown as the locus of beauty himself. So there's clearly some sort of persona being created for him by the artists to show that he himself is embodying beauty. That's my idea. Beyond that, it's just conjecture. We don't know what was in the minds of people. Clearly, there was a lot of love between Dara, Shikoh, and Nadira Banu Begum. But if anyone who is more interested in understanding the nuances of this unique associations and sort of homosociality in the Persian-speaking world, you should look at Afsane Najma Badi's book that came out maybe in the early 2000s, and which has to do with precisely this theme that brings out Afsane Najma Badi. Where in it, the book is, I can just send it to you in the text. Is that all right?
Please, sir, please do.
That'll be easier chat in the chat. I've just sent the resource. That really explains a lot of things as to how is the culture molded around this and what are the passages of particular periods in a person's life. Like there's expected how you embody particular types of ideals as you go through life. I mean, like, in Hinduism, you have the four big phases of life, right? You're youth, but then you're the homeowner, then you're whatever. In the end, the ideal is sannyas. But in this case, it's different, but there are certain passages of life that you go through. And in this case, when you're a youth, whether a girl or a boy, you have this particular embodiment of beauty that is considered by that culture to be ideal. And so sometimes it gets reflected in such ways. But this book really goes into detail with that.
So my next question was about the idealized images. We know that, like you mentioned in your book also, that women were idealized. I mean, the picture that we see is they are idealized. Could it be that the dervishes are also being idealized, or were they open to themselves being painted for a Muraqqa, an elite album?
I think that's a good question, actually. There seem to be open because you have actual depictions of known historical saints and Sufis. So clearly they didn't have an issue. It's interesting, how did they even know this was happening? Because in the entourage of the king or the prince, you would have the artists also there. So if the prince is paying homage to a saint in his khanqa, you would have his guards, his whole coterie, and then you would have painters. And you can see sometimes in paintings where how the artist is making a quick sketch in a scene. So clearly that happened, and then they would go back into their studio to complete the painting. So whether they took permission of the Sufis or not, that's a good question. And it's a fascinating one, like how does that happen? But I think there's a certain type of idealization of the Sufi master as well, but it's in a different way. They're not necessarily shown as these beautiful or iconic individuals. They're shown as wise, white-haired Sufis who basically showing their maturity and their wisdom and their sageness. So I think that's the importance. So there are different ideals that are being depicted.
So my last question is a little far-fetched. When we say Nazr today, the meaning of Nazr is something to do with being jinxing somebody. Does that derive from the Shahidbazi that happened?
No.
And maybe no.
That's more like Nazar Lagna, Buri Nazar Lagna. The
Yeah.
implication is that it's the bad, evil eye.
Yes, sir.
This is just Nazar is more like darshan.
Dash. So, like
Mutual
Didar
viewing.
would be a different word here.
It's the same root. The Didan.
Didan, yeah.
Didan se
Didar.
Didar comes out. And Nazar is the equivalent in the Arabic.
Oh, okay.
And Didan is the Persian. So Didar and Nazar are basically the same in that sense.
Yeah, I think and yes, sir. I think that's about it from my
Right.
side. We have about 2 to 3 minutes, so if audience would like to ask a question, they can. The last question that I think I'll take the last minute, and it's that the so your lectures are so full of information that the questions just keep coming. Uh, so my question was that in the initial slides that you showed us, there were two birds. So you had the duck, and there was, I think, a sparrow. If I'm not wrong, I may be wrong. Is that intentional? Is there some sort of a relationship between the duck and that bird in Farsi poetry, Hafiz or something, or it's just random that love is being showed between two different birds altogether?
Yeah, that's a good question because I haven't paid too much attention on the flora and the fauna of the album. And that would be something worth asking someone who studies botany as well as animals and zoology, just to see like what are the types of birds, which one is the male, which one is the female. Those sort of things I would be really interested in. I haven't done any research on that. So those are really good questions as to why these two birds are shown together, clearly facing each other, clearly connected because of the water and the flowers, but very different species. So what does that mean? I don't have an answer to that actually, but that's something that if I end up doing a more detailed research project on the album itself, every every bifolio needs to be really excavated and researched.
Sir, I remember you mentioning in one of your lectures that you plan to work on Zebunisa's poetry. We look forward to that work, sir.
At one point, inshallah, if time and life allows.
Definitely, sir,
Yes,
inshallah. Uh,
inshallah.
dear audience, that brings us to the end of of this session formally. Should you still have questions, you know our email address. It's karvaheritage@gmail.com. Please feel free to post your questions there, and we would put those across to Murad sir and get back to you. So when you post those questions, please be sure that you mention your name correctly. Thank you very much, Murad sir, for this lecture. Faces of God is available open access. It came out last year, so you can access it very easily on your internet. And oh, sir, there's a question by Ishan.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
that's Praladji, because he visited. I invited him here in Williams College, and we had a performance and concert with him a few years ago. So yes, he's like a guru figure for me. He's wonderful. Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much, sir, for the lecture, and we look forward to hosting you